I really hope this is working, as I can only see my presentation and I can't see any of you guys. So hopefully you can hear what I'm saying. My name is Claire and I work for the Olive Ridley Project. I'm a sea turtle veterinarian and I spent 2 years working in Maldives, rescuing and rehabilitating sea turtles. So this talk is about sea turtles, a little bit about their biology, their conservation, and then I'm going to talk about the work we do and some cases of sea turtles that I saw in Maldives. So a little bit about sea turtles. They're a really ancient species from approximately 120 million years ago, so the Mesozoic era of dinosaurs, and they've been virtually unchanged in all of this time. So they are marine reptiles, which means they're cold-blooded. They rely on the outside water temperature for their internal body temperature. There is one exception to this that I will explain later, but generally they live in tropical waters, which allows them to keep their body warm. They have lungs, so they breathe air. They have to come to the surface and they hold their breath whilst they're underwater. They're incredible divers and they have special adaptations for actually being able to dive really, really deep underwater. They spend most of their time underwater, particularly when they're sleeping, and they just come up to the surface to breathe and to bask and to warm up after dives. They spend pretty much their entire lives in the ocean, and the only time they ever come back to land is to nest. The females come back to nest. They have a really long lifespan, similar to people, living between 60 to 75 years on average, but they can live up to 100 years. And they take a really long time to reach sexual maturity. They take anywhere between 10 and 45 years. Some species actually can take up to 50 years before they can start reproducing and laying eggs. So this has impacts on their populations, and why they're becoming so endangered is because they take so long to actually reproduce. So they have to survive potentially 50 years in the ocean before they can then start to lay their own eggs. All the species of sea turtle are classified as endangered on the IUCN Red List. So a little bit about the life cycle of turtles. So the female comes onto land to lay her eggs, and she digs a nest chamber that's around 1 meter deep, and she uses her back flippers to do that. So once she's dug her hole in the ground, she will lay anywhere between 70 and 150 eggs. So they can lay a lot of eggs in one clutch, and they will return to lay multiple clutches throughout the year. So they'll come between 4 and 6 times to lay different nests within the breeding season. It takes 45 to 80 days for these eggs to hatch, and then it's a real team effort as the turtles have to climb their way up out of that 1 meter deep nest. So it can take about 3 days, and they all work together. So this is why you see turtle hatchlings emerging together at once, because they've had to dig their way up as a team. So once they're out of the nest, they make a mad dash straight for the ocean. They're completely on their own at this point. The mother turtle left right after she laid her eggs, so the baby turtles are on their own from day one. Once they hit the water, they take a big gulp of seawater, and this activates something called the salt glands. So these are little glands that allow them to live in such a salty environment. We as mammals secrete salt through our kidneys, but turtles actually cry it out through their eyes. So the salt glands are behind their eyes. And this is why if you see a sea turtle on land, it may look like they're crying. This isn't like human tears. This is their way of secreting all that salt from the ocean. So once those babies have hit the water, the survival rate from hatching to actually making it to the first few months is just about 1 in 1,000. So they have a really tiny chance of actually making it through those first few months because they're so small, and they get predated on by many different animals. So it's a big task for them in the beginning. Once they're in the ocean, they then enter what we call the lost years. So this basically means we have very little information on what they do with their time. and they generally will find some seaweed or like little life rafts in the ocean of debris, and they'll float around using this as cover, eating really small things like algae and just growing as fast as possible. They then, as young adults or as sub-adults, they head closer to shore. So they move more into coastal areas, and they sort of continue to grow. And then as adults, they will move back to their breeding grounds, and the whole cycle will start again. So this talk is going to mostly be focused on Maldives, because that's where I worked, and that's where Olive Ridley's Rescue Centre is based. So there are 5 turtle species that are found in Maldives. Green and hawksbills are reef species, so you find these on coral reefs if you're diving. And then the other 3, loggerheads, leatherbacks, and Olive Ridleys, are pelagic species. So they spend their whole life in deep ocean, and you tend not to see these unless you're really, really lucky. We can actually identify them as babies from the scutes. So they have different numbers of pairs of scutes, which are the plates on the shell, depending on what species they are. So hopefully these videos are going to work. So this is a green sea turtle. This is actually a younger turtle. They get a lot bigger than this. They grow up to 160 kilos, so they're quite a large turtle, and they can get up to 120 centimeters in length. These are a reef species, and they're mostly completely vegetarian. So as adults, they survive almost entirely off seagrass. When they're younger, they do eat, they have a little bit more of an omnivorous diet, but generally, these are the turtles you'll see grazing on seagrass beds. And then hawksbill turtles. These are also a reef species, so you'll find them eating sponges, corals, anemones, and crustaceans on coral reefs. They have a very sharp beak, which is where they get their name, and they grow up to 70 kilos and about 90 centimeters. So they're a bit smaller than the greens, and they're actually, their meat book is quite poisonous, so they're sources of food poisoning in parts of the world that still eat them, due to their their diet of what they eat on the reef. So loggerheads. Loggerheads are larger turtles again. They grow up to 170 kilos and about 110 centimeters. And these are mostly carnivores, so they eat crustaceans and mollusks and things. They spend their whole life really in open ocean. You tend not to see them on reefs. And then the leatherback turtle. So these are the largest species of turtle. The largest one ever found was 916 kilos, and that washed up on a beach close to where I grew up, actually, in Wales in the UK. And they can get up to 3 meters in length, so they're enormous, enormous turtles. They're the only sea turtle that don't have a hard shell. So all the others have a bony shell that encapsulates their organs. The leatherbacks have like a leathery skin with small little bones in it to give it strength. And these guys survive almost entirely off jellyfish. And then finally, the Olive Ridley. So this video is one of our little patients that we had at our rescue centre. Olive Ridleys are one of the smallest species. They only get up to about 40-45 kilos and about 70 centimetres in length. They are pelagic, which means they live in open ocean. And these guys actually have a unique nesting behaviour. So the other turtles nest individually, whereas Olive Ridleys can nest in mass groups. So the term given to it is arribadas, which is the Spanish term for arrival. And literally hundreds of thousands of turtles can arrive at the same beach at the same time and can lay millions of eggs over a 24-hour period. So a little bit special turtles. We still have absolutely no idea how they do this, how they coordinate this behavior. It seems to be linked with the moon cycles. So a bit about some of the threats. I mentioned earlier that they're most at risk, so 1 in 1,000 survival rate when they're hatchlings. And this is because they're predated by crabs and birds on land as they're making their first dash. Then once they get to the sea, there are many, many fish that can eat them due to their very small size. As adults, it's mostly just the larger sharks that are at risk for adult turtles, and particularly tiger sharks in Maldives. So what are some of the threats to sea turtles? Mainly, and that is human activity. So they can be kept as pets, often in really inadequate conditions. We've seen them kept in bathtubs, plastic bottles, fed human sandwiches, all sorts. So they obviously don't do that well when they're kept in those conditions. They're really vulnerable to getting hit by boats, and can get really severe trauma to their shells. Damaging habitats. So there's two parts of this: when the oceans are polluted, and as well when we build on the beaches that they rely on for nesting. So things like light pollution, noise pollution, it can interfere with their nesting and hurts the populations. Plastic is a huge problem in our oceans, and they can often mistake plastic bags for jellyfish. And they actually have a preference. One study showed that they're eating the white plastic more than the other coloured plastic. We presume because this looks like jellyfish. Fishing gear, which I'll come on to more later, is a big focus of our charity and a big problem for entanglements, not only in turtles but in many marine species. And finally, unfortunately, they are also eaten, both the turtles and the eggs. This is illegal in many countries, but it's a long-standing tradition in some cultures, and unfortunately, it does still happen. So a bit more about ghost nets. So this is something that the Olive Ridley does a huge amount of work to try and combat. Ghost nets is a term that means abandoned, lost, or discarded fishing nets. So they often form large conglomerates of nets and debris in the ocean, and they just continually float around in ocean currents and harm marine life. It's a bit of a vicious cycle because the fishing nets don't decompose because they're made out of plastics. So if they entangle wildlife, marine life, and it falls to the bottom of the ocean, when they decompose, the net's just going to float back up and continue this cycle. And there's a huge hundreds of thousands of tons of fishing nets lost into the ocean every single year. So ghost nets don't just cause problems where they are initially discarded into the ocean. So from fisheries where they're potentially thrown away, they then will float in the current. So this is a big problem in Maldives. They fish using pole and line technique. They don't use fishing nets, but we see a huge number of fishing nets because they're actually floating in currents from other places in the Indian Ocean. So just an example of a ghost net from Maldives. So this is the kind of weight of net that we're dealing with. We're not necessarily talking about individual nets. They can all group together and just cause mass problems. And this is a video that was taken to show a turtle entangled in ghost gear. And you can see how they just really have no defences against these kinds of nets. They get their flippers entangled and they will just continuously swim against the net, and it causes really severe injuries that I will show you later in the presentation. And then this is a turtle that washed up on the island off the rescue centre called Coco, and that was the fishing net that she was entangled in. Luckily, this turtle was rescued and went on to our centre. And just again to show you some of the things we find. So this is a turtle that is entangled in a ghost net, and at some other point there was another turtle in there with her, and that's the humerus bone that the net's just completely wrapped around, and unfortunately that turtle either lost that limb or passed away. So who are the Olive Ridley Project? So we're a UK-based, UK-registered charity that works to protect sea turtles and their habitats in the Indian Ocean. And they do this through various ways. So they have projects in Maldives, the Rehabilitation Centre, and they also run education projects to raise awareness within Maldives. There's projects in Kenya and Oman to ID turtles and working with the ministries there on environmental awareness. And there's a project in Pakistan as well. So actually collecting fishing line, removing ghost gear and recycling this ghost gear into something more useful to prevent it getting back into the ocean. So some of the projects we've worked on is making donkey harnesses, dog leads, fabrics, jewellery out of ghost gear. So trying to recycle it into new things. So a bit about Maldivian culture. So Maldives is a Muslim country, and the language is something called Dhawahi, and it's a very, very unique language. So it's not spoken anywhere else in the world, and it's grown completely in this small country of Maldives. They do not fish using fishing nets, so they actually catch tuna very sustainably using pole and line technique, and a big industry for them, apart from tourism, is tuna fishing. So they have about 1.4 million visitors each year from around the world. The yearly temperatures are around 30 degrees, so it's a really nice climate. It actually sits north and south of the equator, so very nice warm country. So this is just to show you where Maldives is. So it's based in the Indian Ocean, and the island that the rescue centre based is on Bar Atoll. So there's 26 atolls in Maldives. Bar is just west of the main Malé Atoll. There's about 1,200 islands. Of those, about 140 resorts, and there's about 200 uninhabited islands as well. And then this is the island that the Turtle Rescue Centre is based on. It's called Coco Palm Dunikolu in Bar Atoll. And we actually built the first ever veterinary clinic in the country back in 2017. So Olive Ridley partnered with Coco Palm to build the centre. And it consists of 7 tanks. So one is very large. You might be able to see it in the left-hand picture. There's 2 smaller recovery tanks, so as they're recovering from anaesthetics, they can be in shallower water. Equally, if we have smaller patients, we can use these as holding tanks as well. And there's 4 individual holding tanks as well. Due to their solitary nature, we tend to have to keep turtles separate, so they all get their own separate tank. We have surgery facilities, so we have a fully equipped vet room where we can perform surgeries. We have some lab facilities, so we can do basic blood work, look under the microscope at various samples. We have an X-ray machine, which obviously it's quite difficult to do a normal clinical exam on a turtle in the same way that we would with a dog and cat. We can't feel inside the abdomen. We can't listen in the same way we can with mammals. So X-ray is a really good way of actually seeing what's going on inside. We also have ultrasonography as well, so that's a really good way of having a really detailed look inside using various soft tissue windows, so we can look through the skin at their intestines, and we look for things like plastic. We look at the health condition of their liver. We can see if the female is gravid, so if she's reproductively active. Many things we can actually see on ultrasound. So I'm going to move on to some of the cases. So I'm going to start off by showing you a video of a turtle that washed up on our island when I worked there. She actually was in this tarpaulin. So it's not just ghost nets that entangle turtles, it's any plastic debris or rubbish that's thrown away into the ocean. This was a young Olive Ridley, and she was actually really lucky. So we didn't have she didn't have deep wounds at all. She'd ideally, hopefully not been in that tarpaulin for too long. So we assessed her, and then we just were able to actually release her straight away. So she didn't have to come into our tanks for any amount of time. And that's her finally realizing she's free and swimming off. So Kamana was a subadult green turtle that came into our centre. Kamana is a Dhawahi name, so Maldivian language name, which kind of is an endearing term for a girl you might call, female members of your family. So Kamana had a fishing hook that was wedged in her neck. You might be able to see the end of it sticking out in that first picture. So this, unfortunately, was likely the result of illegal hunting in Maldives, because the hook actually went in from the outside. It went through her esophagus and it was lodged near her jugular and her carotid arteries in her neck. So if it had been, potentially a centimetre in either direction, she probably wouldn't have survived and would have not made it to our centre. So when she came in, she had really extensive surgery. We had to go and get the hook very carefully out of her neck and not damage those vessels. But she did really, really well. She made a full recovery and she was released 6 weeks later. And that's her in the right picture. We had to go diving every day to actually collect seagrass for her to eat in our centre. So Penny was an adult Olive Ridley turtle, and she was our longest serving patient at our centre. So she's a bit of a special case for me as well. So Penny was caught in a fishing net and she'd lost her front right flipper. She had to have it amputated because the net had cut pretty much all the way through. So I wanted to talk about buoyancy syndrome, as it's a really common thing we see in Olive Ridleys. Any species can get it, but it's particularly common in the species for one reason or another. Buoyancy syndrome literally means they're excessively buoyant. So it's like if you were trying to dive, you didn't have enough weights, you were completely inflated, and that's what they're like. They're trapped at the surface, and it basically comes down to excessive air trapped within their shell. So this can become trapped within the lungs. So if they have pneumonia, a lung infection, the air gets walled off and they can't expel all the air when they breathe out. It can also become trapped within the shell cavity. So if it leaks out from a lung tear, the air just fills the shell cavity and they float. If they have something stuck in their intestine, then the air builds up behind that impaction and they float. So many different reasons, lots of causes we try to get to the bottom of and we treat. So pneumonias, impactions, we can treat these things and resolve the buoyancy. Unfortunately, some things are a lot more difficult to treat. So lung tears, without very fancy equipment that we're not fortunate enough to have on the island, we can't repair lung tears at the moment. And we have seen some idiopathic cases. Idiopathic means it's a fancy vet and medical term for saying we have no idea what causes this. And there have been some cases in America where they've MRI'd turtles that are buoyant and we can't find a medical reason for it. Potentially there's some behaviour involved with it, because we would find that when they became more stressed, they would float more, and when they were less stressed, they would be able to dive some days. So we had some quite complicated cases. So Penny was buoyant for a really, really long time. That's us going for a little swim in the sea to try and encourage her to dive and to keep her fit, build her swimming muscles. Initially, we used to put little harnesses on them because we were scared we would lose them, so they had little almost like dog leashes when they went for swims, and that's her. She actually did quite well. She was able to pull herself down in the sea where she couldn't do that in our tanks. But Penny wasn't really, she was making small improvements, but she sort of plateaued and she wasn't at the point where she was ready for release. So 650 days later, we're sort of 2 years on and we've had no change in Penny. She's become a bit of a resident at the centre, and we're starting to wonder whether she will ever be released. Maybe we'll have to rehome her somewhere, or find sort of a long-term solution for her. So that was 150 days. One day later, a camera crew arrives and they were just filming some information on the Olive Ridley for a French TV channel. And on this day, little Penny, it was her time to shine. She thought, oh, yeah, I've got my moment of fame. And that was the first day in 2 years she actually dived, and we found her sitting at the bottom of the tank. So she just needed a camera crew and a bit of attention, and that was all that turtle needed to actually start diving. And we released her really soon after. and that's her swimming away. Most turtles actually swim away from us really quickly when we release them, but Penny actually hung out on the reef. We met another turtle along our little swimming travels, and we must have swam with her for about an hour. She was sort of munching on some reef, even though we just fed her. So I think she was a real character of a turtle. So I still feel amazing watching this, because I looked after this turtle for 2 years, and there she is munching on some coral. I don't think she realizes she's an Olive Ridley and she should be eating jellyfish and crabs and things, but she's just having a go at reefs as well. And there we go. I think she's just going off the drop off now, and that's the last time we saw Penny. So hopefully she's having an amazing life in the Indian Ocean, and hopefully she'll have her own eggs by now. Okay, so on to Emmy. So Emmy was one of the first turtles I saw at the centre. She was released just after I started. So Emmy was a baby loggerhead. Loggerheads are a species that generally, to our knowledge, they don't nest in Maldives. We've had a few kind of random accounts of them nesting, but it's not the norm for them to nest in Maldives. So if she was born in Maldives, it would be a really special case. She was being kept as a pet on a local island, and Emmy was actually being kept in a plastic water bottle for her first few months of life. So she came to us. She'd never been able to swim. She'd never been able to dive. So she needed sort of swimming lessons and strengthening up. So loggerhead turtles are amazing. As babies, they really do look like little dinosaurs. They have sort of spikes on their back, and they're very unique. And you can tell a loggerhead when you see them, because they're quite different from the others. And this is us encouraging us to dive after a piece of fish. So hatchlings and young turtles, generally, they do spend their first few years of life at the surface, so they don't dive as deep as the other turtles, but we needed her to have some strength and at least be able to go underwater before we released her. And that was her going. She spent about 8 weeks with us, and she was my first release for Olive Ridley Project. So on to Shushu. Shushu was a young Olive Ridley turtle that came to us, and she had really severe wounds. She was entangled in a ghost net, and if you can see the left flipper in that picture, this is to show you the kind of wounds we were dealing with. We did a lot of flipper amputations, and many of our turtles lost a flipper, and we would often get asked, why that happened and if there was any way we could save the flippers. And of course, there were many flippers we did save. We did everything we could to, we went as far as trying to repair bones and everything. But many of the cases came to us like this, like the flipper was just not even a flipper anymore, really infected and horrible. And unfortunately, in cases like this, they do have to be amputated. So Shu underwent surgery to remove that infected flipper. The surgery went really well. There were no complications from that. But then, unfortunately, as can sometimes happen with anaesthetics, they just can have a bad recovery. Something happens, their body doesn't cope with the anaesthetic as we're expecting. We try as far as possible to get them as stable as we can before surgery. So that's sometimes days of fluids and, getting them a bit stronger. But unfortunately, Shu just became unconscious. She stopped breathing. She lost her reflexes. So we test reflexes to show that a turtle is alive. So this is things like we tap the eye, we see if there's a blink, or corneal reflex is a type of eye reflex that they can lose. They can lose under anaesthetic, but generally they should still have that reflex even under anaesthetic. And Shu lost this reflex. She still had a heartbeat. But turtles can have a heartbeat for 24 hours after they have actually died. So this isn't always a sign that, you know, there's hope, but we just could not give up on this turtle. So we had a heartbeat, so we were going to keep going. So we breathed for Shushu for about 36 hours. We actually had a bag and a tube, and we were breathing for her. We were giving her adrenaline every half an hour to keep her heart going. And probably after the first 24 hours, we thought, okay, you know, this isn't doing anything. We're not getting anywhere. And then just as we were about to give up, she blinked. And she wasn't, you know, coming round at that point, but she started to get some reflexes back. And then 48 hours later, so the right picture is she came to lunch with me, and we just 24/7 were with this turtle breathing for her. Turtles can hold their breath for 7 hours, so it's not like in us you would have to give a few breaths every minute, but in turtles you can just give a breath every sort of 10 minutes, you know, after a while, just to keep them going. So incredibly, after 2 days, she came round, and she's one of my favourite cases at the centre because she was such a miracle, and all the staff at the centre just put in so much work for her, and we were all so pleased. And this is her 6 weeks after her surgery. She made full recovery, and this is her going home. So they actually do really well with 3 flippers. We've seen examples of females nesting in the wild with just 1 front flipper. So not only can they survive, but they can actually go on to breed and, you know, have a normal life. So yeah, we know they can do well with 3 flippers. And then another case. So Faith was a young hawksbill turtle. So she was a reef species, and Faith was, we tend not to see ghost net injuries in hawksbills as much as we do in the olive ridleys. Olive ridleys are pelagic, so they spend their life in open ocean, which is where they tend to encounter these nets. Hawksbills on the reef, they tend not to encounter the nets as much because the nets will get entangled on the corals, but it is seen occasionally. Hawksbills tend to get fishing hook injuries, so when people fish on the reefs, they will swallow the hooks. But Faith, she either had a ghost net or a shark attack or something. We're not entirely sure. The wound on her right flipper, that's how she came to us. She was just found floating very, very unwell at the surface. It's very consistent with a ghost net wound, so we have our suspicions, but because we physically didn't find the net on her, we can't completely confirm that. So Faith was very sick. She was almost comatose, and we did a blood test on her. So the picture on the left is an example of a more normal blood smear for a turtle. In terms of the number of red blood cells. So the little spots are the red blood cells. So the whole slide should be filled, and that's, you know, sort of a more normal number. Faith, however, that's how many red blood cells she had when we looked down the microscope. So we call it a PCV, which is a packed cell volume. And a normal turtle would have 24 to 34% red blood cells within their total blood volume. To compare this with humans, humans can have up to 52%, so 37 to 52%. Faith, the little hawksbill, had just 2%, so a PCV at 2%. Most animals could not survive with this. It's not compatible with life, but turtles, being the incredible animals they are, can actually keep going with only 2% red blood cells. So Faith was actually the first animal in Maldives, and potentially first turtle in the Indian Ocean to undergo a blood transfusion. With such low amount of blood cells, she was completely comatose. We felt this was the best way to try and help her. So we took some blood from a donor patient called Heidi. So ideally, we'd have liked to use another hawksbill. You can get some blood transfusion reactions, although it tends to be safer the first time you do it. But we didn't have any choice. We only had 2 healthy turtles in our centre. Heidi was the biggest, so we took a little bit of her blood to use for Faith. We actually had to surgically access her vein because her veins were so flat. It was very, very difficult to get blood access. So after the blood transfusion, she was a lot brighter, actually. She got her reflexes, which I talked about before. She started becoming a little bit more angry when we were trying to inject her with medication, and she just seemed a lot brighter in herself. She wasn't able to eat, so another thing we did a few days later was actually place a feeding tube. So this is a tube which goes into their stomach. We can then feed them liquid food. By this point, we hadn't given her a full anaesthetic to remove her limb because we felt she just wasn't, it wasn't safe to give an anaesthetic. We were in the process of trying to stabilise her. So she was on fluids, we were feeding her antibiotics, we were doing everything to try and help her. Unfortunately, about 2 weeks, 2-3 weeks after the blood transfusion, Faith passed away. So she was one of the turtles that we lost despite our best efforts. So it's really to show that, unfortunately, it's not all happy endings because of many reasons, ghost nets, human activities. There are many turtles that unfortunately do lose their lives because of these things. So on to a bit of a happier story as we're coming towards the end of the presentation. Chanel was a little turtle that washed up on our island of Coco Palm. So the picture she's on, that's our jetty on the island that the rescue centre's at. And she was a young turtle and she was entangled in that ghost net. She weighed just about 8 to 12 kilos at the time, and the net was about half of her body weight. We took an x-ray. At this point, we didn't have our own x-ray machine, so we used to have to take turtles by boat to a human hospital, and we used to have to use their x-ray facilities. But we found that she had 2 broken bones either side. So the x-ray, the little circles I put on, that shows her this bone here, the humerus. And the black kind of marks you can see, black just means space, air, and the x-ray's gone straight through to the plate. So the net had gone straight through, flippers both sides, and had actually partially fractured those bones. When she came in, she wasn't using these flippers. She wasn't able to use them because of the damage. The nets often sever very close to the nerves, the blood vessels. So we went to surgery, and because it was both sides, we did our best to save the front flippers. So we repaired the tissue, we removed any dead tissue. We just, sort of checked the blood supply, and we could see that there were some nerves and blood vessels still there. Turtles have a remarkable ability to actually regrow blood vessels, and there's some new research coming out on this at the moment. So wherever possible, we try and save these flippers with the hope that they regain use of them. So Chanel actually did amazing, and she regained use of both of her front flippers, and she became a real character at the centre. She was a lovely turtle to rehabilitate, and probably one of my favourites, actually. She spent a couple of months in our centre, and this is her getting released, all happy to go. Oh, so the final turtle I'm going to show you is just a super rare one that I was very lucky to encounter when I was in Maldives. So Cloud was a green turtle. but Cloud was leucistic. So leucism is like being an albino, but not full. So albino is a complete loss of pigment, whereas leucism is a partial loss of pigment. So Cloud was mostly white, but she still had black eyes. She didn't have the red eyes, and she still had a tiny bit of pigment just on her shell in some places. So she had leucism. This is incredibly rare to see this, and particularly an older turtle. So you can imagine baby turtles have a 1 in 1,000 chance when they're black and sort of blend in. You can imagine if you're white and you're floating in the ocean, how much of a target you would be. Cloud had scoliosis, so we x-rayed her. She had a bit of a deformed spine. She had a hump that was there, but it didn't seem to affect her. She dived really, really well. We actually thought she was found floating, so we actually thought, you know, potentially there'd been some damage. She had some illness, but we couldn't find anything wrong with her from doing testing and from observing her. And we later found out that potentially she was being kept as a pet. There were some rumours that she was actually being kept in a bathtub in the capital until she got to this size. So although we can't sort of confirm those rumours, it would make sense why she would be found really sort of floating off the capital without having been seen before. But Cloud did really, really well, and we actually released her. After, I think she only spent about a week in our clinic. We were happy for her to go back to the ocean, and that's her hopefully swimming off to have a lovely time. So I'm going to finish the talk and then take some questions afterwards if anyone has anything they'd like to ask. First of all, a bit of code of conduct when you're swimming with turtles. So as divers, hopefully watching, you'll hopefully see lots of turtles during your time diving abroad. The most important thing is to sort of be quiet and gentle around them. Don't swim sort of directly up to their face and try and put cameras right in them. You might scare them, and you know, sort of always remember that we are in their environment and we're just sort of there to observe them. Don't swim right on top of turtles if they need to come up for air. Obviously, we don't want to be directly on top of them. And try and approach them from the side, so that's where they have the best field of vision, and just gives them a little bit of space. Try and stay a few meters away from them at all times, and don't chase after them if they are swimming away. That obviously means they're not comfortable with us, and we should respect their space. Don't ever try to touch turtles. I've heard some stories of people snorkeling in various parts of the world, and the guides actually encourage them to touch the turtles. I was actually in Maldives, and a really lovely guide was really excited that I was a turtle vet, and was so excited when we were snorkeling. He swam down and actually picked up a turtle to show me, and I had to explain that we really can't do that. So even if in some places they say, oh yeah, they like being touched, like please don't touch them. Just watch them, take lots of pictures, but no head rubs. They not only is it's also dangerous to us, they have a really sharp bite, but it's not very pleasant for wild animals. It goes for any marine life. We shouldn't be touching them, or you know, should just be enjoying being in their presence. Finally, please don't try to feed them as well. So you know, they play an important part of the ecosystem, and they have their natural diet, so we shouldn't be interfering in any way by trying to feed them any more snacks. So what can you do at home in terms of helping turtles, helping the charity? So it's really important to reduce plastic consumption. One turtle I saw was entangled in just 2 plastic bottles, and she lost a flipper from that. And it really shocked me, because I thought, gosh, that's, you know, for the average person, you might have 2 plastic bottles a day. You know, lunchtime, you're just having a drink and you don't really think anything of it. But actually, all this single-use plastic, you know, where's it going? Plastic's only been around since the 60s, and already we have so much of it in our oceans. So we really need to you know, stop using it wherever possible. So recycling's great, but I think the main thing for us all is to actually stop using single-use plastics and try and find alternatives. you know, bring your own cups. It's a bit different at the moment with COVID, but, you know, usually bringing your own cups to coffee shops and things like this. And looking in supermarkets, you know, they always individually plastic wrap things. So trying to find maybe the loose fruit and veg, and just being aware that, you know, plastic's a big problem. And if we all tried to make small changes, it would go a really long way. Trying to eat sustainably, so trying to eat fish that's been sustainably caught. So it's been caught using a pole and line technique. It's not been caught using fishing nets. So basically, don't be afraid to ask questions, and you know, checking the labels on products in the supermarket, doing your own research to make sure that, you know, what you're eating has actually come from a sustainably sourced place. Part of sustainable fishing is that they only take the adult fish as well. So the small baby fish they will throw back to help replenish fish stocks, whereas nets are just completely non-discriminative. So they will take, you know, all the marine life in that area, and whatever gets wasted will just, you know, get discarded. So it's very, very wasteful to actually use fishing nets. Spread the message about conservation. So just, you know, anything you might hear during our presentations or during this whole conference as a whole, you know, if there are other groups that you've been captured by something they've said, just talking with your friends and family about it, getting in touch with either ourselves or other people if you wanted to find out more information, and also just, you know, enjoying nature, enjoying the environment. I think, you know, if everyone in the world loved diving, loved being in the ocean, enjoyed ocean activities, and just viewing the amazing marine life that we have, I think there would be a lot more people that would want to protect it. So just, you know, really relishing the environment that we have, and it will help sort of drive that passion to sort of, you know, make changes in our oceans. So finally, how can you support us as a charity? We're completely reliant on donations to keep our charity running, like our rescue centre and our projects in other countries. So to keep allowing us to release turtles, any money you could donate would be insanely appreciated, particularly in these difficult times that we're all going through. We have an Adopt a Turtle scheme. So if you have either yourself, friends, family, you need Christmas ideas, then you can adopt them a turtle, and they will get updates about how their turtle is doing, and a sort of a certificate and things. So it's a really sort of lovely sort of gift idea, and someone can have their own turtle that they can follow. So finally, following us as well on social media, check out our website. We've got loads of information on there on turtles, and, you know, lots of publications and things you're interested in. We've launched an e-learning school and e-learning platform, so there's loads of presentations on there, and you can get a huge amount of information. So that's our website down there, and I just want to say thank you so much for listening. I really hope this presentation worked, because I've just been staring at my own presentation for the last half an hour. So if it's not worked, I apologise. And I'm here to answer any questions. So thank you very much. I'm just going to try and switch over to the other screen. Oh, great, you can hear me. Okay. Okay, a question from Mike and Samantha. Thank you very much. You've said all my examples are female. That's actually a really interesting question, and you're completely right. So the majority, I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but it's something like 80 to 90% of the patients we had in our centre have been either female, or I should say a juvenile. So we only know if a turtle is male or female when they get to sexual maturity. So when they're adults, we can tell the difference because the males have very long tails and the females have short tails. When they're younger, so when they're juveniles, we actually have no idea you know, what sex they are. So I think we're in the habit, because all of our adults, apart from, we've had 2 adult males in our centre out of 120 females. That was the last statistic I had from working there. So only 2 of them were males, the rest were females, or we couldn't tell. So I think out of habit we would sort of all call them girls, but potentially a lot of our younger turtles like Shoo Shoo or Chanel, you know, they could have been male, they could have been boys, but there's various ways we think potentially more females are caught in fishing nets. They group together in really large groups outside their nesting beaches. So there's hundreds of thousands of turtles and males as well, but the females hang around in the area to sort of keep going back and laying their eggs. So potentially, to my knowledge, we don't have any proof of this, but we definitely would see more adult females than males. So this is potentially a reason why. So great question. Thank you. Any other questions? Great. Well, what I'm going to do, we've now got a fantastic presentation by Jo, one of our turtle biologists. So I'm going to say goodbye for now so that she can get ready to give her talk. And please stay on to listen. It's a different presentation. It's more about turtles and less about the rehabilitation side. So there'll be a lot more information for you guys to be able to hear about. Any more questions, feel free to post on our booth. We're sort of around most of the day and we're going to be answering questions, and it'd be really great to get in touch with some of you guys and, you know, the work you might be doing as well. So it's always great to hear from you. Okay, thank you very much for watching, and yeah, stay on for the next presentation. Goodbye.